Welcome to Full Moon Film Buff, episode 40. Finally hit 40. We're going to talk about The Boy Who Cried Werewolf from 1973. I watched this on YouTube. I had not seen this before. First, let's discuss the prominent crew and cast. The film was directed by Nathan H. Giron, written by Bob Hummel, with effects makeup by Thomas R. Berman. The film was the final effort of director Nathan Giron. He's probably best known for his work on the science fiction classics Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Thomas Berman had a long career in the FX makeup industry. We'll see his work again as part of this project in the great Teen Wolf and Teen Wolf 2 movies, as well as the 80s remake of Cat People. He started as an assistant makeup artist on Planet of the Apes. A couple of other gems from his filmography include Wayne's World and Howard the Duck. The cast includes Kerwin Matthews as Robert Bridgestone, Elaine Devery as Sandy Bridgestone, and Scott Seeley as Richie Bridgestone. Robert J. Wilk played the sheriff. Susan Foster was Jenny. Jack Lucas was Harry. Bob Hummel was Brother Christopher. Loretta Temple played Monica. And George Gaines was Dr. Martirosian. Kerwin Matthews is easily most famous as Sinbad from the Ray Harryhausen stop-motion classic, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. He was the stop-motion king, starring in The Three Worlds of Gulliver and Jack the Giant Killer as well. Elaine Devery did a lot more TV acting, but she did a decent number of films over the years. Robert Wilkie started his prolific career as a stuntman before converting to predominantly villainous roles. He was notably a member of the Frank Miller Gang in High Noon, which connects him to Lon Chaney Jr. Weirdly, Robert also appeared in another movie I very recently discussed in an uncredited role, The Catman of Paris, almost 30 years before this film was released. George Gaines fluently spoke 5 different languages. His most famous roles were probably in Punky Brewster, or playing the same role in all 7 Police Academy films. So, I'm a little surprised to find that I do recommend this film. I have to admit some prejudice going in. I mean, I felt like if the only way I could track down to watch a movie is on YouTube, it can't be very good, right? If the production company or the distributor doesn't have the faith to be putting it out on any one of a number of streaming services we have these days, and there's not a DVD release, then how good could it have been? Another sign that I interpreted as poorly was that there is a 2010 TV movie of the same name made by Nickelodeon, and I assumed, you know what they say about assumptions, that movie was a remake of this one. It's not. Apparently, they don't have anything to do with each other. This movie turns out to be pretty good. Okay, it's pretty tame in the werewolf attack department. Lots of people die, lots of victims are killed, but just not on screen. We don't see any of it. There's no on-screen sex or nudity. The situation Richie finds himself is the interesting part. Richie knows what's happening. No one will listen to him. I liked it, and I have a lot to say about it. But first, we need to go over the synopsis. Divorced father Robert Bridgestone takes his son Richie to the family's mountain cabin. During a moonlight hike, Richie is attacked by a werewolf. Robert saves his son. The werewolf falls down a hill and is impaled on a fence post, but not before biting Robert. Upon investigation, the attacker is found to be human. The local sheriff concludes the man was a crazy drifter. Richie insists it was a werewolf, but Robert and the sheriff laugh that off as nothing more than childish imagination. Concerned about Richie's story, the ex-wife Sandy insists Robert talk with Richie's psychiatrist. Richie has been studying werewolves and knows all about them. The psychiatrist worries Richie's werewolf fixation stems from an inability to accept his father killed a man. Instead, Richie has concocted a fantasy wherein his father bravely battles a monster. He suggests Robert take his son back to the cabin, predicting that when Richie returns to the scene and sees that everything is normal, his interest in werewolves will cease. Oh, the doctor does make sure to charge Robert for the full hour. Meanwhile, the sheriff deals with a roaming religious hippie commune. Weird guru leader and all. They travel with this huge protective cross. The sheriff tries to run them off, but they have the proper paperwork. Returning to the cabin during another full moon, Robert experiences a wave of pain and sends Richie ahead to the stream to fish. Robert transforms into a werewolf. When Richie sees what is apparently the original werewolf resurrected, he screams for his dad and flees into the woods, crossing a mountain road. The werewolf pursues. causing one vehicle to leave the road and roll down a hill. Another van crashes, and the werewolf dismembers the driver. Richie comes upon two newlyweds camping. While they don't believe his story, they do see his distress and agree to take him home. Arriving at the cabin, Richie's father is nowhere to be seen. Richie begs the man to let him stay at the camper for the night. The next morning, Robert shows up at the camper and tells the couple he has been searching for Richie all night. Robert doesn't remember anything about being a werewolf. Richie tells his father about the werewolf, but Robert is losing patience with his son's fantasies. The police figure that an animal killed the van driver, but don't know what kind. During the next night's full moon, Robert transforms again and searches the house for Richie, who, in anticipation, hid himself. The werewolf seeks out the newlyweds, pushing their camper down a hill. He mutilates their bodies, carrying off one of the heads. Returning to the cabin just before daybreak, he digs a hole in the shed with a shovel to bury the head. Richie, hearing noises, sneaks down and witnesses the werewolf revert into his father. Moments later, the sheriff arrives to report on the various killings, convinced that the attacks are somehow all connected. On the drive home, Richie questions his father about his actions. Robert dismisses everything, clearly irritable and bothered about his memory blackouts. Richie jumps hurriedly out of the car upon arriving at his mom's, telling her he is scared to be alone with his dad because his father is a werewolf. Sandy doesn't believe Richie's werewolf story. Sandy relays Richie's fears to Robert. Another visit with the psychiatrist is in order. The doctor tells Robert that Richie genuinely believes Robert is a werewolf and that this type of fantasy can be quite powerful for children. The doctor tells Robert that lycanthropes suffer from amnesia and their hands become deformed the longer they are infected. The doctor seems to believe all the legends of werewolves come from some historical reality and knows quite a bit about lycanthropy. As the psych session goes on, the full moon rises, and Robert kills the doctor. Meanwhile, Sandy tells Richie she will go with him and Robert to the cabin, this time for a family weekend. The next day, Richie and Sandy prepare to leave for the cabin with Robert, unaware that the headline of the morning paper reads, "Local Psychiatrist Murdered." The three set out for the cabin, stopping at the hippie commune on the way. With their wild-eyed leader, the hippies form a circle of power to drive away evil spirits. This is getting into full religious cult status. When the family stops to watch, the hippies shout at them to join in. While an amused Sandy agrees, when Robert tries to enter the circle, he is stopped short and cannot move further, as if an invisible barrier prevented him. The cult leader says if he pulls Robert into the circle, the evil will be forced out of him. I wonder if it would have worked. We don't find out. A disturbed Sandy grabs him, and they get in the car and continue to the cabin, where they settle down for the evening. Sandy confesses she really misses Robert, and that perhaps they should get back together. She tries to seduce him, but he can feel the effects of the full moon. His eyebrows are epic. As the full moon rises, Robert gets away. In the shed, he finds Richie digging up the bag he saw his father, in werewolf form, bury on their previous visit. Robert grabs Richie, clearly in the first stages of transformation, and begs Richie to lock him in the shed. Richie does so, but as he finishes, Sandy sees him and hears the noises in the shed. Richie tells her that werewolf dad is in there. She scolds Richie and tries to open the shed. Richie screams just as a clawed hand bursts through the door. Richie and Mom run to the car, escaping as the werewolf emerges, screaming and snarling. The werewolf attacks the hippie commune. As the sun rises, the werewolf collapses. I'm not sure where the whole night went. And seriously, the whole night is gone in like a few scenes. The hippies witness the beast transform back into Robert. Though they don't understand what they are seeing, they pray for the creature's soul. Upon regaining consciousness, Robert flees into the woods. Richie and Mom seek help from the sheriff. Upon returning to the cabin, the creature is gone. The sheriff leaves men to stand guard. Robert watches from the woods and notices that his index finger has become deformed. The sheriff thinks the hippies are high when they tell him about the werewolf. The locals believe and start talking about a posse. Later that evening, as Sandy sleeps by the fire, the werewolf slips silently through a cabin window. Sandy awakens to find it staring her in the face. It tries to carry her off. On hearing her screams, the deputies burst in, opening fire as the monster jumps out the window. Richie begs them not to hurt his dad. Everyone still cannot accept that it is a werewolf, let alone Richie's father. That evening, the sheriff organizes a search party. The hippie leader accidentally knocks over their protective cross and takes this as a sign that they should leave. Werewolf Robert evades all searchers. Richie breaks away and heads off to save his father. As the moon rises, Richie finds his father, who grabs him and carries him off, with the posse close behind. Cornered, the werewolf attacks Richie, biting him on the arm before a hail of gunfire distracts him. The bullets can't kill him, but while frantically attempting to flee, he stumbles and falls on the broken stake that held the hippie's cross to the ground. It pierces his heart. As a horrified Richie and Sandy watch, the werewolf transforms back into Robert. The last thing we see is Sandy examining her son's bite mark with dawning horror on her face, implying Richie is cursed to become a werewolf now. The transformations in this film are fine. They're nothing spectacular. They're neither great or bad. Standard series of film dissolves. One interesting tidbit is that they are dissolved between still frames rather than short clips, so it looks a little static. The upside of that choice, however, is that they could choose the best frames that line up nearly perfectly. So I like that, but it still felt a little stilted because it was just frame to frame to frame. I do like the werewolf makeup job. The facial applications have greatly improved at this point in film history. They can elongate the actor's jaw and nose. The filmmakers are confident enough in their makeup job to give us several good looks at the werewolf in decent lighting. I love this development. This is fantastic. The makeup job isn't the best, but it is really, really good, and I did like it. Now, this werewolf is the infectious kind. Robert gets bit. Richie and his psychologist do a great job of spelling out the werewolf lore in this film. Richie lists all the ways that a werewolf can be killed. Stab it through the heart, bash its head in with a silver weapon, or shoot it with silver bullets. The werewolf seems to be immune to all normal weapons and non-silver weapons of any kind. The film sticks to the full moon being the trigger for the involuntary transformations. And I did really like the one newish addition of the deformed longer index finger serving as an indicator of the lycanthropic curse while the afflicted person is still in human form. That's a cool new addition. So that's our new tidbit. So the primary theme of this movie is summed up by the phrase, believe kids. No one believes Richie's story. We're all familiar with the parable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, which the film references in its title. This fable teaches an important lesson about trustworthiness. In the story, a young shepherd boy responsible for watching over sheep near a dark forest gets bored and decides to play a trick on the villagers by yelling wolf, even though there is no wolf. The villagers rush to his aid to protect the flock and the boy, only to learn that it's a false alarm. The boy finds this amusing and does it again a couple of times. Eventually, however, a wolf does come, and the boy finds that this time when he cries wolf, no one comes because they don't believe him. Multiple sheep are killed. In some versions of the story, the boy himself is killed. The boy learns the hard way that liars are not believed even when they're telling the truth. And that once you lose someone's trust, it's very, very difficult to regain it. This film flips that moral on its head. Richie is telling the truth from the beginning. No one believes him anyway, which is a powerful and unfortunate fact. We tell kids that if something bad is happening to them, they should find a trusted adult and tell them. And I hope that most of the time the kid is believed. But too many times the kid isn't. Richie claims he saw a werewolf. I would have a hard time believing that if someone told it to me as well. I don't want to push too hard on this metaphor. Richie's parents take his claims seriously enough to set him up with a psychiatrist. They don't brush him off and they don't say he's making it up, but they also don't believe him. The movie goes out of its way to show Robert as generally a good father. On the other hand, Richie is afraid of being with his father, and it's not hard to see the metaphor of an abusive father, whether it's alcohol or some other form of abuse. Bottom line, Richie asks for help and he doesn't get it. And that's the metaphor of the movie. This is the first film that I've been able to watch for the project where a kid faces off against a werewolf. And I do think that the Spanish language movie, Chabelo and Pepita versus the Monsters, that came out of Mexico the same year, also has a juvenile protagonist, but I can't find it dubbed or subtitled in English, so I'm not 100% certain. But it is an interesting subgenre of the werewolf film. It heightens the power disparity between the werewolf and the hunted. There is a reason why the protagonist in a lot of horror movies is a woman. People root for the underdog. David against Goliath, right? the werewolf already has a relative strength advantage against humans. That's even more extreme and pronounced when the human is a juvenile. I also wanted to take just a moment and talk about this film's relationship with divorce and feminism. Sandy left Robert in large part due to feminist concerns. However, the film seems to take a pretty lukewarm position here. The couple still cares for each other and seems to be doing a pretty good job, at least before turning into a werewolf, of co-parenting Richie. Robert seems to have wanted a more traditional spousal arrangement, and Sandy wanted to re-enter the workforce. At some point, she felt like she couldn't get the support that she needed from Robert, and so she left him. Robert initially expresses a desire to reunite with her, and she's not interested. But later in the movie, she reveals that she's begun to doubt her own decision and that maybe she does want to get back together with Robert. The primary purpose of the divorce in this film is to create a situation where Richie has to face the werewolf alone. If Sandy and Robert had been together from the beginning, well, then Mom would have been there and either would have seen the werewolf or the film would have had to work much harder to explain why she doesn't see it, why she doesn't believe Richie. By adding the divorce element, it puts Richie with each of his parents one at a time instead of all three together until the very end. Another interesting thing that I noted in this movie is that this is the first film I've watched for the project that is pop culturally savvy in a self-referential way. What I mean by that is the newlywed characters in this movie, in this horror movie, know about werewolves from horror movies. Before this, lycanthropes were treated as myths or legend. They were something that people knew about out of books and stories, but this, they know about them because of movies. It's an interesting possible wrinkle to films going forward. Does the werewolf, as represented in the film, support or subvert the popular conception of a lycanthrope, either the actual pop culture reality or the fictional pop culture referenced? I know that all probably sounds unhelpful and a little like some circular logic. It's not critical to this film, so I won't dwell on it too much here, but it probably will become critical at some point in a future film. I'm pretty sure that this is going to become an issue. Lastly, I do want to at least mention the Christian hippie cult. This was such an odd inclusion in this film to me. They do play an important, however minor, role in the narrative. Their protection circle helps Robert figure out that he really is a werewolf, and they ultimately, unintentionally, kill Robert with the stake. To me, they felt primarily like comic relief, and I'm not 100% certain that that was the original intent of the filmmakers. I can imagine an alternate version of this movie where the hippie cult clashes more with the sheriff and maybe even perhaps becomes a red herring in who's actually killing all the people in the forest. But that's a pretty different version of this film. They were a little jarring and didn't really mesh with the rest of the film for me. So if you like lycanthropes, like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to share your thoughts and additional observations that you might have had down in the comments. Let me know if I missed something or if you spotted something else. Next, I plan on discussing Blood from 1973, so keep your eye on the moon, a silver bolt in the chamber, and we'll see you back here next episode.